Welcome to Peer Treatments in PeerTracker. I'm Dan Capinos.
And I'm Carly Campione. We represent the technical consulting group for Aon Hewitt, New Bridge Street, McLaughlin, and Radford. In the last decade, one equity compensation tool has become increasingly popular: performance awards based on relative total shareholder return, otherwise known as relative TSR. As institutional investors and the press continue to place more and more scrutiny on executive pay practices, relative TSR awards attempt to combine the best features of other equity comp designs, namely the leverage opportunity and shareholder alignment inherent in stock options, along with the share ownership benefits for the executives themselves. For a relative TSR award, the executive is granted a target number of awards at the beginning of a performance period. Depending on how the company's stock price performs relative to a peer group, the number of shares that actually vest at the end of the period may be less than or greater than the target number originally granted. One of the first steps you must take when designing a relative TSR award is the comparator group. But what to compete against? Is it an index, like the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ 100, or should it be a custom group?
Regardless of whether you choose an index or a custom group, you should be aware that there are many corporate transactions that could affect your peer group during the performance period. These transactions include mergers and acquisitions, bankruptcy, going private, and spin-offs.
Depending on the index, you may also see peer companies transfer to other indices after superior performance. An example of this is when a company increases in value and moves from the S&P Midcap 400 to the S&P 500, which is a large cap index. On the other end of the spectrum, a company may leave an index due to extremely poor performance, such as when a company gets downgraded from the S&P Midcap 400 to the S&P Smallcap 600.
As you can see, choosing the appropriate peer group is just the first step. If your peer group is a known index, you then need to make a decision about the overall peer group treatment. The first option is an open peer group, which means that the ultimate comparator group will be comprised of the companies in an index at the end of the performance period. In other words, the companies that you're initially ranked against when the period begins may not be the same as the companies that will be used to determine the final ranking and actual payout. Be aware that this may cause a survivorship bias in your peer group, since the higher performers survive and will likely maintain their position in the index, whereas the lower performers are often dropped from the index altogether. To reiterate Carly's point, this may not matter as much when competing against the S&P 400, as companies can be both promoted or demoted from the index. However, when using an index like the S&P 500, the top performers will always remain.
The second type of peer group treatment is closed, which means that the final ranking will be determined using the companies that were in the index when the performance period began. It should be noted, all custom peer groups are closed by default. Because of this, over 2/3 of all relative TSR plans have closed peer groups. We should also mention that Aon Hewitt believes closed peer group treatment is the most theoretically correct. Like Dan mentioned, open peer groups have a survivorship bias, which means you are not recognized for exceeding poor performing companies.
Whether you choose open or closed peer group treatment, there are still decisions to be made about peers that experience certain business events during the performance period. We recommend making these decisions before the period begins, since it will make the administration of your plan much easier.
Especially if you have a large peer group, such as the Russell 2000, you'll find significantly more M&A activity within the peer group, and you'll save yourself a lot of time if you anticipate these events and have a plan in place for appropriately updating the companies in your peer group.
First, we'll discuss best practices for open groups. There are two general situations companies should be aware of when using an open group. The first is when a replacement company does not have data going back to the beginning of the performance period. Because such companies were not subject to the same market environment as the rest of the peer group, we feel it is best practice to exclude them from the final ranking altogether, rather than calculate their TSR based on the truncated performance period. The other situation is when a replacement company does have data going back through the start of the performance period, but may not have been publicly traded throughout the entirety of the beginning average period. In these situations, we would recommend including that peer in the final ranking, since they were active for the actual performance period, but using the shortened beginning average date range.
For closed peer groups, there are different situations to consider. First, we would recommend removing peers that were acquired during the performance period, or went through a merger where the peer company was not the surviving entity. Similarly, you'd want to remove a peer that experienced a spin-off during the performance period, where the spun out portion maintains the original peer company stock price experience. Now, we have seen instances where companies blend post-event stock price experience for M&A situations, but Aon Hewitt believes this process is too subjective, and it often results in TSRs that aren't comparable to the rest of the peer group. For several other business events, it is best practice to keep the peer company active. For mergers and acquisitions where the original peer company survived, it makes sense to keep them in your peer group. For peers that continue trading after a spinoff, you should also keep them active in the peer group, but be sure to reinvest the spinoff dividend that was paid to shareholders when you calculate TSR to make up for the spun out value. You may also have peer companies that declare bankruptcy during the performance period. It certainly makes sense to keep them in the peer group so your company can benefit from outperforming the bankrupt company. With this consideration, we would recommend keeping them in the peer group but moving them to the bottom ranking. Finally, you should keep peers that had a ticker change during the performance period, since it should have no impact on stock price performance, nor the nature of the company. The good news is, Aon Hewitt PeerTracker service can save you a lot of time by automating most of these transactions on your company's customized website. For example, how would PeerTracker automatically handle a peer company going bankrupt?
That's a good question, Carly. After a company files for bankruptcy, we are promptly notified by our data provider, the S&P's Capital IQ. Capital IQ will change the company's trading status from active to in bankruptcy, and we will immediately address any PeerTracker sites that use the ticker. If you've pre-selected a preferred treatment for bankruptcies, such as keeping them in the peer group but at the bottom of the rankings, this would happen on the same day that Capital IQ changes the trading status.
What about an M&A situation? How would PeerTracker handle an acquisition?
Another great question. Just like in the bankruptcy example, we're notified of the transaction through our data source. When a company is acquired, their trading status switches from active to inactive in Capital IQ. If you've instructed PeerTracker to remove acquired companies, this would happen automatically after the status change. If not, we will notify you of the transaction to understand the plan's intentions. You should be aware of the different ways that PeerTracker treats open versus closed peer groups. Since indices may reconstitute just once a year or as often as once a day, Aon Hewitt checks the current components of all open groups on a quarterly basis. After each quarter end, your consultant will review any changes to the peer group for reasonability and the overall impact on your company's ranking, and notify you if necessary.
For closed peer groups, your consultant will notify you once a quarter, or as needed, as companies are removed from the peer group or are modified for events such as bankruptcy or spinoff. Also, there is a downloadable file of peer TSR calculations available through PeerTracker, which will maintain any removed peers. They will be shown below the actively ranked companies, along with a short description of the reason for exclusion.
While it would be nice if we could anticipate all events that could affect the makeup of your peer group, every now and then special circumstances pop up. This is even more likely if you have a large peer group or many global peers.
Here's a real-life example we experienced recently. A Swiss company had a relative TSR plan with a Chinese peer company that was suspended from trading for misconduct. Do you remove this peer company? Or continue to calculate TSR assuming zero trading volume over the suspension period? Dan, what would you recommend in this situation?
Well, my first thought would be to try to match the plan's intentions. In this example, the client has already specified that it wants to keep bankrupt companies at the bottom of the peer group. I'm inclined to advise that being suspended from trading due to misconduct should be treated similarly to being suspended due to bankruptcy. I think it's quite reasonable to argue that the Swiss company outperformed the Chinese company and should therefore benefit from that outperformance when determining the final ranking. Of course, there are other options to consider. Excluding the company altogether is one option. Another is calculating the Chinese company's TSR through the last trading date. Or perhaps you'd want to assume any prices post-suspension simply had zero trading volume. This is why these special situations are discussed with the client to make sure we have the proper intentions of the plan recognized.
In conclusion, there are many moving parts within relative TSR plans, with many considerations to make.
And the more decisions you're able to make up front in regards to your peer group treatment, the easier the administration of your plan will be.
Regardless of your preferred peer treatments, a detailed review of your peers will be performed throughout the performance period, as well as at the conclusion when the final performance assessment is determined. Don't forget, your PeerTracker subscription includes a final certification letter signed by your consultant validating the results.
Rest assured, with PeerTracker, your award will be able to handle all the little changes your relative TSR plan throws at you.
For more information, please visit our free web portal at www.relativetsr.com.
And of course, please feel free to contact Carly, myself, or your consultant for any questions on PeerTracker or the tracking of your relative TSR plans.
Happy peer tracking!